So hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Jimena. I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Long Island Sound Study National Estuary Program. Today's webinar is part of the Community Science Long Island webinar series that's hosted by the Long Island Sound Study, New York Sea Grant, and the SeaTech Environmental Association. The purpose of this webinar series is to highlight local community science or citizen science programs going on in the region and talking about how they help local environmental management and research efforts. So today I'm joined by Ariel Santos, the Policy Program Coordinator for SeaTech and my partner in crime in putting this webinar series together. And we have our three panelists today, Catherine Feedy. She is a biologist with the Marine Invertebrates and Protected Resources Unit of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. We have Matt Sclafani. He is a marine educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension. And both of them are project leaders for the Horseshoe Crab Monitoring Network. We're also joined by Justin Bob. He is a marine science PhD candidate at Stony Brook University, where he is conducting research on horseshoe crab population movements in New York State waters. So for today, we're gonna have Catherine start us off, and she's going to cover general horseshoe crab information, natural history of horseshoe crabs in the region, and she's gonna cover information about the horseshoe crab monitoring effort with volunteers. And Matt will be answering questions through the chat and through the Q&A. And then we'll have Justin talk a little bit about his research. And at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. So a couple of things before we get started. First off, just to let you know that this is being recorded. The recording will be available to you in the next couple of days in the Community Science Long Island website, which I think Ariel posted in the chat. Number two is that this is a webinar, so you should all be muted and your cameras are off, so we can't see you, we can't hear you. No worries there. But if you want to share resources or comments or questions, absolutely feel free to do so in the chat. And especially if you have questions, feel free to put them, submit them through the Q&A button. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And that way panelists can easily access those questions and answer them. So yeah, that's all I had to say. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right. I'm just gonna, okay. So thank you for that introduction. And I will be starting off this talk, and then about halfway through, we're going to switch over to Justin. So we are today going to be talking about the New York Horseshoe Crab Monitoring Program that we have done for about the past 15 years on Long Island, and hopefully you can learn some new things, and we'll be happy to answer any questions about volunteering or this program in general when we're done. So horseshoe crabs, for those that don't know, are more closely related to arachnids than they are to crabs. There have been fossils that have been found 450 million years ago, so many people consider them living fossils. There are currently only 4 species of horseshoe crab in the world, and we have the one species in North America, which we are familiar with, which is the Limulus polyphemus. And you can see that with the blue range along the coast in this picture below. So the range is from Maine to Florida, but Delaware Bay by far has the largest spawning biomass and is kind of considered the main hub for our population. And then we also have 3 species in the Indo-Pacific, which are shown in this picture in the orange and purple in the globe below. The main purpose for horseshoe crabs from a fisheries standpoint is the bait industry. So many fishermen will collect horseshoe crabs and use them for bait in the whelk and eel fishery. So when that happens, obviously these crabs are taken, they're put in the pots and are considered dead after that because they're used for bait. But there's a very important industry that uses horseshoe crabs and keeps them alive. So the biomedical industry has harvesters. It's about 5 companies in the US that will harvest these crabs and will bleed them. And you can see this picture below is showing that process. So their blood contains LAL, which is the FDA gold standard for detecting any negative pathogens. So any vaccines or medically implanted devices, pretty much anything that's going into your body will go through this LAL test first before it is approved. So I'm sure you can see the importance with everything with the COVID vaccine. So this has been brought up quite a bit recently with the vaccines, but in general, it's a very important industry that horseshoe crabs help provide. Another side that horseshoe crabs are very important for are for migratory shore birds. This bird right here is the endangered red knot, and they make one of the most intensive migrations, which is shown right here on the right in this map. So they make their migration, which is about 10,000 miles from the tip of South America all the way up to the Arctic. And one of the stopover points is Delaware Bay, where they feed on the horseshoe crab eggs to give them energy to finish up this migration. So red knots heavily rely on horseshoe crab eggs, and they're not the only shorebird that does, but one of the shorebirds that gets the most attention. A little bit about the biology of horseshoe crabs for those that don't know. Like I mentioned before, they're called crabs, but they're actually closely related to scorpions and spiders. In general, they're a pretty long-lived species, living about 20 years, but they have a very late maturation period, which takes about half their life to become fully mature. So once they are mature, they have a very high fecundity, which just means that they release a lot of eggs during these spawning events. And these eggs and larval phases have a very high natural mortality, as we can see from the previous slide with the shorebirds obviously feeding on the eggs. But then once horseshoe crabs reach their adult stage, they have a relatively low natural mortality. So these are just 2 pictures of horseshoe crabs in case you have never seen them before. And the cool thing, at least I think, about horseshoe crabs is they're one of the marine species that's pretty easy to determine the sex of each individual. So these crabs, if you flip them upside down, they have their appendages on the side, and this little box shows the difference between a male and a female. The male will have a thumbs up kind of shape or a boxer glove to them, where they actually use this to latch onto the females when they're spawning. And then females have these scissors or peace signs. So it's pretty easy to tell just by flipping the crab over if you're looking at a boy or a girl crab, which, as most people know, fish and other marine species is not necessarily as easy to do that. Continuing on with their life history, these horseshoe crabs will come in the spring up until the estuaries and bays, and where they will deposit their eggs in the intertidal zone. These eggs, once they're fertilized, will incubate for about 14 to 30 days and then hatch, and they're often very dependent on temperature. After they hatch, they remain a larvae and are planktonic stage for about 6 days, and then they will settle down to the bottom. And then obviously you can see that crab is very small, and for it to get to an adult size, it has to go through multiple molting events, each time shedding its shell and growing a little bit further each time. So they molt about 18 to 20 times before they reach their sexual mature age, which I mentioned before is about half their lifetime. Once they are mature, they will move to offshore waters in the fall and the winter months. And then once springtime comes, they will come back into the bays and estuaries and will start this whole process over again with laying their eggs. Here is a better look at the actual spawning of horseshoe crabs. So this picture right here is a pretty typical spawning event. You have your one female, which is significantly larger, and then you have these males that are crowded around it. So normally they will latch on, but some that don't latch on will also just, they will crowd around it, so they also have a chance to have a successful spawning event. So the female will lay its eggs externally and often bury in the sand while doing this, and then the males will latch on and hopefully have a successful spawning event. And like I said, just because you're not that crab that's on the back doesn't mean you won't have a good chance of having a successful event. Oftentimes there is a lot more males on these beaches than females, and you can kind of see here in this picture as well, they're often much smaller, so they're easy to tell a difference. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is the organization that helps regulate all species along the coast, and horseshoe crabs is one of those species. They do stock assessments every 5 to 10 years. So in 2019, there was a stock assessment that was done. New York, unfortunately, was given a poor status for the horseshoe crab population. And in New York, in this assessment was considered New York and Connecticut. And you can see the Northeast and Delaware Bay were considered neutral status, where the Southeast was given a good status, and overall, the horseshoe crab population along the coast was given a neutral status. So on the left over here is just a graph showing you the different types of collection and harvest for horseshoe crabs. And you can see this dark blue is by far the most every year, and that is the commercial bait. So like I said, majority of the horseshoe crabs are taken for this bait industry. And you can see since 1998, they've kind of leveled off. And then starting in 2004, you have this orange bar, which is representative of the biomedical collection. So these horseshoe crabs are bled and then released back into the wild alive. Most of these crabs do survive, but you do have a small amount that don't. So that would be indicated by this green bar, which is the estimated biomedical mortality. But overall, much, much smaller than the amount of crabs that are taken for the actual bleeding and for commercial bait landings in general. So ASMFC adopted the fisheries management plan in 1998, which required all states to have some type of monitoring for horseshoe crabs. And then in 2006, the DEC funded this long-term monitoring project, which I will be talking more about, and Justin will be explaining the results of. So the goals of this program were to design a quantitative spawning survey that helped New York by developing an index of spawning activity. So every year we have some kind of way to determine if the population is changing, is staying the same, increasing, etc., over the whole island as well as state, site by site. We also wanted to have this data so it's consistent with this coastwide stock assessment, and that it can be used for management plans. Currently, this survey is not used in the assessment, and that's only because other surveys had a much longer time series for it. But the goal is eventually to have our survey being put into this stock assessment for management. However, we do use this survey now on the state level to help with our management plans and any different policies that we would need for horseshoe crabs. And then a big thing too is to encourage citizen participation and stewardship, which is why you're all here and why we're having this webinar. So about the survey itself, we had to modify an existing plan that they use in Delaware Bay. Like I said, they do have the largest biomass. However, Long Island covers a much larger geographic area with several distinct estuaries, where Delaware Bay is just focusing on Delaware Bay. In general, we have much lower spawning densities, and we also have submerged spawning. So not all crabs come completely up onto the beach out of the water. We have some sites that crabs are spawning still underwater, sometimes as deep as knee deep in the water. So we had to account for that to make sure that those were also counted in our survey. And then, as I'm sure most of you already know, access to the beaches is not always easy. On Long Island, it's not as easy as parking and just walking. So that just also had to be taken into account. So the surveys are conducted during the evening spring tides of the new and full moon. So since these crabs are coming up in the spring, the majority come in May and June. So we survey 2 days prior on and then 2 days post the new and full moon. So in total, we're doing 12 nights of the year that we are monitoring all of our sites. And we have counts that are made along a fixed transect at the beach. So what that really means is that we have this part of the beach that we will always consistently survey each night and each year. Obviously, they do change year to year a little bit, but overall they're pretty consistent. So these two pictures down here are from the Delaware Bay survey, where they have quadrat protocol sampling. So this is just a 1 by 1 meter square of PVC that they will take a fixed distance that they predetermine before each survey and walk along the beach. And we can say that, for example, we have 10 steps. So every 10 steps, they will put this square down. They're going to count the crabs in the square, and anything out of the square will not be counted. And this is done basically because if you were to count every single crab there, you would be there for all hours of the night and you'd never finish the survey. So we have 4 sites on Long Island that do this type of sampling, but for the most part, since we have much lower spawning densities, we just walk along the beach and count whatever horseshoe crabs we see. So we count how many males and how many females as you're walking along. And like I said, they're pretty easy to tell which is which, because you have the females, which are much larger, and the males, which are much smaller. If you are unsure, like I said, you can always go over, flip them over and see which appendage they have. And then it's a sure tell way to see which sex you have. So these are all of our sites, all these red dots along Long Island, all the way from Staten Island to Fisher's Island. And I can say we did not start with this many, but we're pretty proud of how our survey has expanded across all of Long Island. So we have 4 geographic subregions. We focus on the Long Island Sound, the Peconic Estuary, the South Shore Estuary, and then Jamaica Bay and New York Harbor. So we have over 30 sites and over 600 volunteers that participate annually. For those who are interested in helping us, I would say the best thing to do is to go to our website, which will be put at the end of this presentation, but will also be put in the chat. And from there, you can decide which location would be best for you. Usually it's one that's close to you, because like I said, some of these are done in the middle of the night, so they're not necessarily normal hours. And you contact that site coordinator, and they will be able to help find the best time for you to come and volunteer for the survey. Unfortunately, this year, due to COVID, we are limiting the volunteers' participation to mostly just the site coordinators. But if you're very interested in helping us out in years to come, please feel free to reach out to us or to the site coordinators that seem to be the best for your area. And hopefully you can keep in touch and help out in the coming years. So as we are going down the beach and we're counting all of our horseshoe crabs, we do have to walk back. And as we walk back, we will also tag any crabs that we see left. So on the left is how we measure them. We just take these big calipers and we measure their width, and we'll record their sex. And then afterwards, we will put in a button tag, which is seen over here on the right. And all we have to do is drill a little hole or poke a hole, depending on the tool that we are using, and just pop that tag in. I promise you it doesn't hurt the crabs, and they go off on their merry way and they're happy. I promise. Just a little bit more of a summary for what the tagging process will look like. You have these big spawning groups as shown in figure 1. And then if you have that many crabs, obviously we want to get as many tags out as possible. So picture number 2 will just show the multiple people that are always needed to run these surveys. And because I said it's done at night, we do have our headlamps on to help us see. So these volunteers are measuring and tagging each crab and then just leaving them right where they found them. Picture number 3 is just a close-up of this tag, the tags that we use. If anybody does see these tags, we would greatly appreciate it if you would report where and what tag you found. So all you'd have to do is go to that website that's on the tag, put in your name, put in your contact information, the tag number, and then the exact location that you found it. And all of this data is extremely important, and you will hear more about it with Justin's section just in a little bit. So he will get into the details of why this data is so helpful and useful for us to understand this population. And then picture number 4 is just the final results of a horseshoe crab that's been tagged. And it's just another picture to show you how the male actually clasps onto that female. And once they're tagged, they just will swim like that and be on their merry way. So it's all good things. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Justin.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. All right. We good? Can everybody see? Awesome.
Yep.
So thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. And today I'm excited to share some of the modeling results that I have done to estimate survival migration using the citizen science data that hundreds of volunteers have collected over the past decade and then some. But before I go into that, I just want to explain why understanding survival and migration is important in the context of understanding population ecology, in particular to fisheries management. So here, this is just a summary of different mechanisms of mortality and on the top of our window here. And you can see that we have different age classes of fish. And I just want to emphasize that survival may vary across different life history stages, but in particular, with the adult stage, we're interested in survival because ultimately they're responsible for reproducing and sustaining populations because they need to lay eggs and spawn, etc. So we were interested in understanding adult horseshoe crab survival in particular because we wanted to understand how it varied spatially across different management jurisdictions and different regions with different harvest pressures and so on and so forth. Because if survival is relatively low within a population, it may suggest that, the population may be going towards an unviable state. So this is one of the reasons why we wanted to estimate survival within horseshoe crabs. And then another fact that we wanted to understand is migration patterns, because just like survival, migration is just as important in the context of management. For instance, there are many marine protected areas in the US and abroad that tend to protect species. And if you have net movement out of a protected area, those individuals may be more vulnerable to environmental or anthropogenic or human-induced perturbations that could leave them at risk of lower survival and production. And particularly within the New York region, we don't know what type of movement pattern horseshoe crabs exhibit relative to other counterparts throughout the US East Coast. So for instance, in the New England region, there are populations that particularly exhibit resident movement
Justin?
patterns. Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt, but we are getting people saying that they can't hear you very well.
Okay. Let me see here. Is it better now or no? Is it the same?
Can people weigh in? Is that helpful?
I just tried changing the audio. Let's see.
It's the same.
Same. Do you want me to try calling in?
Yeah, you can try that.
Let me see here. Sorry for the interruption. Let's see. Let me just change the audio here really quick. Switch to phone audio. Okay.
No worries. He's connecting his audio to his phone and he's gonna call in. Hopefully that'll help solve the issue.
All right.
Yeah, it works for some people, not everyone. So Justin, are you calling from the number that was sent to you from the panelist email?
I'm doing one of the numbers on my audio here. Let me see if I can.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
If it's through the Zoom, yeah, it should be giving you the right one, the panelist number. Yep.
Okay. All right. Let me see. Okay. Oops.
In the meantime, folks, how about this? I had a poll that I was supposed to give you in the beginning and I forgot. So let's answer a poll. I'm going to launch that while Justin is setting up his audio. All right, so on your screen now, you should see a poll. We want to know a little bit about you and who's here. We're asking, where are you watching us from? What is your field of work? And how familiar are you with horseshoe crab science? Obviously for that last one, you know, pretend you didn't hear 20 minutes of horseshoe crab science already, but compare how familiar you were. All right, results are coming in. Gonna give it a moment. Okay, looks like they're done. Wait, no, people are still answering.
Okay, can people hear me better now? Hello?
Is that better? I think that's better. I hear you better. Can people weigh in on the chat? Yep, that works. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, cool. All right, that's awesome. Let me just mute my computer.
Oh no, you muted yourself.
Hold on. We're good now?
Yep.
Okay, good, perfect. All right, so as I was saying, we wanted to investigate the movement patterns of horseshoe crabs in the New York region because there is a limited amount of knowledge within the South Shore of Long Island in particular in terms of exchange between Long Island Sound and the continental shelf and surrounding areas. And we also wanted to see where they fit into this migration structure between New England and the Mid-Atlantic, because these populations exhibit different types of migration patterns. So for instance, in the Mid-Atlantic region, horseshoe crabs exhibit this movement phenomenon known as partial migration, whereas a large proportion of individuals will seasonally migrate between the continental shelf and the estuaries between the spring and fall seasons. And just to emphasize this on the right-hand side, this is just a conceptual diagram of movement between the estuary and the continental shelf. So this blue bubble here on the bottom represents the estuary, the orange represents the ocean. These green crabs represent those that are migratory, and whereas those regular tan crabs are the ones that remain resident year-round. And partial migration is thought to be important in terms of buffering population declines in many animals, as they are able to access a variety of resources and boost their evolutionary fitness. Whereas in New England, horseshoe crabs tend to exhibit permanent resident populations year-round and are highly local or express highly phylopatric movements, suggesting that they tend to remain within the estuaries for foraging and spawning, etc. So with that being said, what we wanted to investigate was survival migration between these three different regions that I have presented here in this map. So we have the North Shore in red, the blue shore represents the South Shore, and then these orange and yellow color represents the Jamaica Bay region. The reason why we delineated these three different types of groups to estimate survival migration was to better understand variability across space and time in terms of survival. We also wanted to understand the exchange between different regions with different harvest pressure, because for instance, the South Shore region tends to have higher harvest pressure on average relative to the North Shore. And there's also very limited harvest that occurs in the Jamaica Bay region year round. So given these differences in harvest pressure, we wanted to see if there was any types of patterns following harvests within the region. So what we did is we ran market capture models from 2007 to 2016, integrating tag data only from crabs released within New York. Over this period, we had an astonishing amount of crabs released. We had over 22,000 individuals tagged and 879 unique recaptured individuals, which is pretty impressive for this kind of scale. And from there, from the previous lack of knowledge and other studies, we formulated multiple hypotheses regarding survival migration, which I'll elaborate in the next two slides. But before I move on, I just want to emphasize, if you want to look more into the technicality of this study, we do have these results published in the scientific journal Estuaries and Coasts. And then here is the title of that as well. So our first hypothesis is that we expected survival to be greatest in the Jamaica Bay region due to stringent harvest protections occurring there relative to other regions. So this map here kind of shows you that breakdown of the annual state harvest in these respective regions on average. So the South Shore region comprises roughly around 64% of annual harvest. The North Shore represents around 27%. And then that Jamaica Bay region comprises less than 5% on average. And it's predominantly closed to harvest due to the Gateway National Recreation Area preventing wildlife from illegally being obtained. So with this kind of in mind, what we found was that we noted that in the North Shore of Long Island, we noted that this is where the highest adult survival rate was found at around 68%. And then when you look into Jamaica Bay and the South Shore highlighted in this yellow and blue region, we noted their survival rate, according to the y-axis here, is around 53 to 55% on average. So we didn't find a substantial difference in terms of the South Shore and Jamaica Bay survival, which is interesting. And this is suggesting that survival may not be the only attributing factor to these low survival rates that are occurring, because Jamaica Bay, as I mentioned, is predominantly close to harvest. So this is interesting in terms of trying to understand the other underlying mechanisms, such as environmental impacts, influencing this Jamaica Bay survival rate in particular. And I'll elaborate further into other mechanisms into this regional pattern later on. Our second hypothesis is that we expected there to be sexual differences in survival, because previous studies have suggested or inferred that in harvested populations, females tend to be preferred in the bait harvest industry relative to males, because as Catherine mentioned, females are larger on average. So fishermen tend to get greater value out of larger horseshoe crabs, or at least that was the hypothesis. So therefore, we assume that females would have relatively lower survival, or much lower survival relative to male. And this graph here on the left-hand side shows you the size frequency of males and females within our study sites. So you can see highlighted in blue on the bottom, the average chromosomal width was around 200 millimeters in width, whereas females, the average was around 250 millimeters in chromosomal width. So there definitely is a substantial difference in size between sexes. And this bar graph here is showing you the sex-specific survival rates across the different regions, going from Jamaica Bay, the South Shore, and North Shore from left to right. And again, we have that survival probability on the y-axis. And we have males highlighted in blue, females are in red. The main points I want you to take away here is that given these overlap and error bars, there is actually no significant difference within each group in terms of survival between sexes. So we noticed that the closest averages between sexes occurred actually in the South Shore region, where the majority of harvest is present. And in the North Shore, there was about a 10% difference in mean survival. However, once you got towards Jamaica Bay, there was a substantial difference in survival, but it wasn't statistically significant. So further, market capture models, as more data comes in down the line, may suggest a significant departure of survival between different sexes. But it's interesting that there's still this trend for females to have lower survival in a protected area that is not subjected to fishing. So we need to further investigate, potential mechanisms behind this disparity in sex in Jamaica Bay. And lastly, we thought that we assumed that there would be low exchange between different regions in terms of migration estimates throughout the Long Island region, because previous studies have suggested that horseshoe crab movement is not really high in terms of magnitude within each year. So if I draw you to this map over here, there are two studies that had over a decade's worth of data that found there was limited movement between the Jamaica Bay and South Shore region, as well as from Connecticut to New York and Long Island Sound. And in fact, there was less than 3% of crabs that moved from Connecticut to New York in Long Island Sound over a 15-year period. So that's why we assumed there was a lack of movement between regions. And we also wanted to investigate movement from the South Shore into Jamaica Bay and Long Island Sound, simply because we had no previous results regarding movement between those water bodies. So this map here is showing you the average migration rate over that 10-year period of tagging effort between the different regions. And there are two main points I just wanted to make here. One is that when you look at Jamaica Bay into Long Island Sound and vice versa in terms of movement, the total movement rate is less than 2% in each direction. So that's suggesting there's limited exchange between Jamaica Bay and the North Shore in terms of adult horseshoe crabs. But then when you look from the South Shore into the North Shore, into Long Island Sound, you see almost 2 times higher migration rates. So this is suggesting that there may be a slight preference for adult horseshoe crabs moving northward from the Atlantic Ocean and the South Shore into the Peconics and Long Island Sound and the North Shore. And the largest migration pattern we noted, which was surprising, was between Jamaica Bay and the South Shore region. We noted that there was roughly 20% average migration occurring in this direction, whereas in the inverse direction from the South Shore to Jamaica Bay, there was only 3.5% migration occurring there. So this is suggesting there's a large preference for migration from Jamaica Bay to the South Shore of Long Island. And in terms of sex-specific differences, we have males on the left and females on the right. And this is the same type of plot that I showed on the last slide, showing you those mean migration rates. For the most part, sex-specific differences in migration rates did not differ. It differed maybe less than 1%, with the exception of, again, that movement pattern from Jamaica Bay to the South Shore region. We noted that females on the right-hand side had 10% higher survival on average relative to males, which is suggesting that females may have like a higher preference for migrating or higher propensity for migrating in this pattern from Jamaica Bay to the South Shore. So overall, our conclusions with these survival analyses are that for hypothesis 1, we noted that the North Shore had the highest survival rate relative to the South Shore and Jamaica Bay. And we think that this difference between the North Shore and South Shore survival pattern is mainly due to horseshoe crab spawning behavior and harvest pressure. So for instance, in the South Shore of Long Island, peak spawning abundance typically occurs 2 weeks earlier relative to spawning in Long Island Sound on the North Shore of Long Island. And based on how the New York State harvest is set up, once 50% of the annual quota or the allotment of harvested individuals is reached per year, the daily harvest limit that a fisherman is allowed to catch is cut in half. So what we think is going on in terms of driving this greater pressure and harvest in the South Shore is that there are greater abundances of horseshoe crabs occurring earlier on the beaches in the South Shore when daily harvest limits are higher. And once 50% of that quota is reached, by the time fishermen are moving to the North Shore, 50% of the quota has been attained, and thus there may be lower daily harvest restrictions in place. So those crabs on the North Shore of Long Island may be less acceptable to higher daily harvest limits and lower harvest pressure overall. And in terms of Jamaica Bay survival, it's unclear to what factors are influencing their survival with time because, like I said, harvest doesn't appear to be influencing their survival rates there, but there could be other sources of mortality associated to pollution or habitat fragmentation that requires further investigation. And in terms of addressing hypothesis 2, as I mentioned, we found differences in survival, or some subtle differences in survival between sex, with the exception of Jamaica Bay. It wasn't statistically significant, so it requires more tagging effort to further help resolve this pattern. But what we found was that essentially in the harvested regions in the South Shore and North Shore, the sex-specific differences in survival didn't differ significantly. So this indicates that there is really no preference by fishermen in terms of harvesting a certain sex. And lastly, in terms of our conclusion for migration, we found that there was more moderate exchange than previously found in other tagging studies, with Jamaica Bay serving as the primary migration source to the South Shore estuaries and the Atlantic Ocean within state waters. And we noted again that there was relatively little exchange between Long Island Sound and other regions. But overall, this trend in terms of movement from Jamaica Bay to the South Shore and the South Shore to the North Shore is suggesting there's a preference for movement northward, or net movement northward by horseshoe crabs. And there was little differences in transition between sex, except for that male and female migration rate from Jamaica Bay to the South Shore region. So now moving on to the spawning survey analysis. As Catherine mentioned, that was one of the goals of the horseshoe crab tagging survey. So what we found was that, or what we wanted to investigate was that we wanted to look at trends in spawning abundance across different beaches and at the estuary level. So what we did is we used this index of spawning activity, which is the average number of females and males per square meter of beach. We monitored the spawning indices over a 12-year plus period between the Acoustic bays, the North Shore of Long Island and Long Island Sound, the South Shore estuaries, and Jamaica Bay. And we ran a mixed model analysis to examine estuary-wide trends as well as beach trends across time through years. And this next graph here shows you the different trends in spawning indices for females. So on the top row, we have Jamaica Bay females on the left. The right side, we have South Shore, the spawning indice trends on the right. North Shore is on the bottom left, and Peconic females are on the bottom right. And there are two main takeaways I want to emphasize here. One, you can see these different colored, regression lines showing different trends at different beaches within each site. So for instance, if I draw you to the Jamaica Bay region, you notice that there's two beaches that have experienced relatively precipitous declines over the past 12 years or so. Whereas during roughly that same time period, and just a little bit shorter time, there's been increase in other beaches. So this is just highlighting the importance that to examine the estuarine level trends in abundance, you also need to look at the beach level trends because there's considerable variability in terms of increases or decreases in horseshoe crab abundance. Another pattern I want to note here is that there are differences in the magnitude of abundances between water bodies as well, which is important to consider because the magnitude of decline or the magnitude of abundances may confer differences in the severity of declines or increases that you see in each population. So for instance, if you have a population that has lower spawning abundances, if you reduce that population even slightly lower, that may have a larger ramification in terms of reproduction output and productivity years down the road. And for instance, in Jamaica Bay, there tends to be twofold higher magnitude of spawning indices relative to the Peconic bays. So again, it's important to examine the estuarine level trends because they also have different baselines in terms of spawning activity. But overall, these estuaries tended to have either declining trends or relatively stable. There appeared to be a lack of increase in most areas. And just to conclude this presentation, I wanted to go into some recent underwater movement analysis of horseshoe crabs with acoustic telemetry that Matt, Catherine, and I have been involved with over the past few years. This is not part of the tagging survey, but I thought it would just be neat to kind of present you with some different types of movement research within, the field of aquatic animal ecology. What we're doing is we're essentially monitoring horseshoe crab movement with the easy pass of the sea, or also known as acoustic telemetry. So acoustic telemetry uses the power of sound to detect where animals move in different environments under the water. Pictured on the left-hand side here is a crab showing you a acoustic transmitter, which sends out a unique sound signal every 1 to 2 minutes underwater. And once this crab comes in the vicinity of roughly around 900 feet of a receiver, which is pictured on the right-hand side, this receiver is under the water and detects that sound signal. And since we know where that receiver is, we're thus able to know where the general distribution of horseshoe crabs is through space and time. And luckily enough for horseshoe crabs, they don't get charged on a toll when they get detected on a receiver, unlike us in the Easy Pass system. So over the past 2 years, what we found was that over the past 3 years, from 2017 to 2019, we monitor the movements in an acoustic telemetry array in Murch's Bay. Each of these blue circles here represents an acoustic receiver. We had receivers from the eastern and western portions of Murch's Bay, as well as in the inlet, to understand migration patterns to and from the estuary and the continental shelf. And we tagged individuals in a variety of locations represented by these yellow and white stars representing adult and juvenile release patterns. So we wanted to not only look at adult movement, we also wanted to investigate juvenile movement and understand their spatial distributions and habitat use relative to adults. So we tagged roughly over 90 horseshoe crabs between juvenile and adult age groups. So this slide here is showing you the movement of each individual represented by a different color and circle from 2018. And we're entering the spring spawning season now in the middle of May. So you can see these crabs are making relatively rapid movement from Murch's or into Murch's Bay from the continental shelf. And you can see their dispersal is relatively widespread in the early spring into midsummer. And then once you start to reach towards end of July into September, they start to slow down. And this may be due to the fact that horseshoe crabs tend to forage after they spawn to replenish their lost energy sources that were invested into reproduction. You can kind of see, some individuals are moving faster than others, where others are remaining more resident in different habitats. But this is just a neat way of showing you the diversity of movement patterns that horseshoe crabs exhibit on a finer scale through space and time. And as we head towards October, you start to see some crabs funneling into the center of the bay and then migrating back out into the ocean to overwinter, as Catherine mentioned, on the continental shelf in the winter months. And then as for juveniles, there was a lack of juvenile movement relative to adults. They only restricted themselves to about a third of the area of the bay. And this is showing you in May into early July, their movements throughout the bay. So it's not as complex as the adult movement patterns, but this is important because this is suggesting juvenile horseshoe crabs may not utilize as many habitats. Therefore, they may not have the same foraging requirements or habitat requirements that are needed for adults. So this could be important in terms of understanding and identifying critical nursery habitat. And although this isn't a part of the citizen science survey, if you ever see an acoustic telemetry tag on a horseshoe crab, please email Matt, Catherine, and I. We'd be happy to know because this is useful information for our study in terms of investigating movement patterns of horseshoe crabs. And So with that being said, I hope you all enjoyed this presentation. We want you to hopefully participate and gather participants in terms of the New York Citizen Science Survey. And it's not only helping out New York populations, but it's also being integrated into stock assessments across 4 different regions throughout the US East Coast, as Catherine mentioned. So your data not only helps New York horseshoe crab populations, but also the entire US East Coast as well in terms of horseshoe crab management. And with that being said, we'd like to thank all of our acknowledgements from the New York State DEC, US Fisheries and Wildlife Service, Stony Brook and Cornell Cooperative Extension, and of course, all of the dozens of citizen scientists that have helped make this study possible. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Justin and Catherine and Matt. You've been batting all those questions. So we've got about 8 minutes left for Q&A. So if you haven't submitted a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A or in the chat. But I'll go ahead and see. It looks like, Catherine, you wanted to answer this one live. Why are these crabs being harvested for the gram test applications mentioned earlier?
So right now there are no biomedical facilities in New York that are harvesting them for biomedical purposes. So any crab that is being harvested in New York is being used for bait. The eel and the whelk fishery is a very popular fishery, and currently there is limited regulations for whelk, so it makes fishermen life a lot easier. There is being legislation being pushed through to change that for the whelk fishery. So we're hoping that with those regulations, there might be some changes that we also see with the horseshoe crab population. But yeah, currently New York does not allow for the biomedical, so it would solely be for bait.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. There were a couple of questions related to that, and with regards to the sex ratios and what can be expected given the use of potentially different sexes for the bait. So somebody said, where was it? Okay, so Vicky asked, could the decrease in movement from Long Island Sound to Jamaica Bay area and vice versa be due to the lack of habitat connectivity between those sites, perhaps due to lack of sandy shoreline wetland and increase in the deeper water in the area due to the decades of dredging activity for the shipping channels or hardened shorelines?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Yeah, so that's a good question. Hold on, I'm just trying to look at your typed response so I can see it. Let me see here. So the movement between Long Island Sound and Jamaica Bay, yeah, we think that due to like the hydrographic complexity of the East River in terms of tidal currents, as well as just that it's, a much narrow area of transit that, may be much more difficult for a crab to harvest, to move. We also think that it may not be a preferred movement area just because the habitat quality in the, East River in particular is not, very good, especially compared to some other areas in Long Island Sound out to the east. So we think it could be a combination of maybe habitat quality and currents kind of influencing that movement pattern. However, we don't know the underlying mechanism that could be preventing them from that, and that requires further investigation.
Can I just add to that? First, I just want to say great presentation to you and Catherine, and it's good to be here and see everybody today. So, just to kind of follow up on this, I think one of the things we had just talked about last week with the Peconic Estuary program, when we gave a similar webinar, was that habitat is becoming a really important issue, I think, and it's going to become one of the dominant issues because there's a lot of, problems with obviously shoreline hardening that are going on. And it was quite staggering to see the amount of bulkheads that were just in the Peconic Estuary have gone up since Hurricane Sandy. It was a tremendous increase. And so, but there's a lot of these things are in going to experience even more problems because of sea level rise. So you're going to lose that intertidal spawning habitat potentially over time. And, that might already kind of have happened in some of these areas to the west. And also Jamaica Bay, just is a very eutrophic system. So the habitat quality might be very poor, and there could be other reasons for lower survival. It could be also that they're moving out because perhaps it's suboptimal habitat that we would expect that they would need. So they might make the choice to actually leave that estuary. And we just don't know. It definitely requires a lot more research to kind of get at those mechanisms. But this tagging data is really valuable, and it has revealed a lot more than we would have expected. Also, not seeing as strong of a difference between the sexes as you might have anticipated for these metrics was a little bit interesting too. We had anticipated females would be strongly preferentially harvested, and that was not apparently the case with respect to survival. So, I mean, there's a slight indication of that, but that wasn't as strong as we had initially had hypothesized. And the lower survival was a really important finding overall, I thought. So we have a long way to go in this research, but hopefully that addresses some of the questions for the tagging. I think, Justin, there was another question in there from Jessica Donnelly that touches on that. Maybe you want to follow up as well. And I see it posted up on the Q&A list.
Yeah, is this the one with the New Jersey versus New York?
Yeah, that actually there's actually it was from Christina Cologne, I'm sorry, or Ann Seligman. So do you see it? It says who migrates versus who remains resident in areas where there is a mix, young, old, female, all?
Yeah, so to answer that question, so the question is who migrates versus who remains resident in areas where there is a mix, old, young, male, female, all. So that's a good question. We've been able to get at some of these demographic differences in the acoustic telemetry realm of things. So what we found was that in terms of drivers of migration, there was no difference in male and female migration offshore or between Murch's Bay and the continental shelf, according to our acoustic telemetry study. However, we were interested in looking at a mixture of different age groups with acoustic telemetry. However, given that we only had half of the individuals redetected in the inlet, and we had more skewed distributions to the young and middle age classes, we were unable to really determine, just due to lower sample size, if age was a factor in terms of migration. But that's something I definitely want to investigate further down the road.
All right, so we have 1 minute left. So here's one question. Historically, did Baymen always take male and female crabs? Sorry, I can't see very well. Or did they focus on harvesting the females with the notion that the eggs were an attractant to eels and conch?
Well, that's a good question. I think, we've always heard that females are preferentially harvested, but interestingly, we didn't sort of see that as strong as we would have thought. And also the DEC data seems to indicate from the harvest that happens in New York that it's more of a equal removal. And when you talk to Baymen, it seems like some people, do seem to want to use female horseshoe crabs, and they really say they work better. But then other Baymen just say, nope, we just use whichever, and they both work fine to attract the whelk or eel. So it's a good, I think females are larger, so they probably like them for size as well. But they're just not as abundant as the males. There's a sex ratio, as we showed in the slide, of about 3 males to every, female. So easier to collect as well.
All right, so I see here that Catherine wanted to answer this one. I'll give this one and one more and then call it a day to respect everybody's time. So do you think that state conservation policy may play a role in survival in terms of New Jersey and New York? New Jersey versus New York plays a role in the survival of the crabs. And there was another question about whether if the sound that the acoustic monitor makes, does it bother other marine organisms that might be sensitive to sound?
I'll try to answer that first one quickly. The main difference between New York and New Jersey is that New Jersey actually has a moratorium on horseshoe crabs. So New Jersey's fishermen are not allowed to harvest in New Jersey, but they did not close their eel or whelk fishery. So somehow they are still needing to get the bait for their pots. So I do believe that does play a role. How big a role it plays, I'm not sure, because like we said, there obviously is some legal, forms of bringing the crabs over here, and that's totally fine, and everybody needs to make a living. But how big of a role does that play? It might be a little bit more than we would like, especially since we are so close and it's an easy thing to do. And I'll let Matt or Justin talk about the acoustic.
Yeah, so for the acoustic side of things, it's at a relatively high frequency relative to the majority of other marine animals within our local region. So usually it's out of that maximum decibel range that most animals can hear. So usually like for marine mammals and things like that, that have, more sensitive to hearing, it doesn't affect their movements. And in fact, it's actually used to monitor marine mammals, sea turtles, sharks, etc. So this acoustic telemetry tool has been used for a variety of different animals with a variety of different capabilities of hearing.
All right, great. So it is 3:02. I'm going to wrap it up. I know that we didn't get a chance to answer everything, but Ariel posted our emails in the chat. So if you do have any questions for any of our panelists or for Ariel or myself, feel free to send us an email. Thank you so much again for joining us today. The next presentation in the Community Science Long Island series will be on water quality, and it'll be May 13th. So we hope you join us there. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.